Several G7 leaders are summit hopping today, heading from England to Brussels, where NATO is holding a meeting of its 30 heads of state and government. U.S. President Joe Biden wants to strengthen America's ties with the alliance after the Trump administration. For the first time, NATO leaders are expected to adopt a statement pledging more action against global warming. NATO's troop withdrawal from Afghanistan is also on the agenda. Members are expected to call on China to respect international commitments. Ahead of the opening, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg clarified its position on Beijing.
There are, of course, opportunities, and we need to engage with China on issues like climate change, arms control. But China's military buildup, growing influence and coercive behavior also poses some challenges to our security. And we need to address them together as an alliance. We are not entering a new Cold War, and China is not our adversary, not our enemy, but we need to address together as an alliance the challenges that the rise of China poses to our security.
DW correspondent Terry Schultz is standing by at NATO headquarters. So, Terry, NATO's Secretary General there saying that we're not entering a new Cold War with China. But what can we expect from NATO in its response to China?
Good morning, Terry. Yes, NATO very much hopes there will not be a new Cold War with China. China spends with abandon on its military. It has the second largest armed forces in the world after the United States, and it already has the largest navy. It is not bound by any arms control treaties. So this is very much a country that NATO wants to keep on the level. It does not want increased tensions, especially when the relationship with Russia is going so badly and requires so much attention from NATO allies. So I would say that Secretary General Stoltenberg was being a bit euphemistic in saying that it is not an adversary. That's how NATO wants to keep it. But NATO allies are very worried, the United States foremost among them.
OK, so what else is on the agenda there today at that NATO summit, Terry?
Well, even though China has risen to the top of the agenda, which I might add is quite interesting because it was only 2019, the first time NATO addressed China at all. But everything else still remains on the agenda. As I mentioned, Russia, very much a concern. Relations with Russia going very badly, especially between the U.S. and Russia, which hopefully will be addressed later this week when Presidents Biden and Putin meet bilaterally in Geneva. The Trump administration's insistence on European allies spending more on their own military, trying to get to this 2% pledge, that's not going away either. And President Biden is going to be quite stringent about this, perhaps putting it in more delicate ways. But the United States is really tired of European allies not putting enough money and resources into their own armed forces. One other issue that is quite interesting, rising up NATO's agenda as what they call a crisis multiplier. It will be high on today's summit communique. That is climate change.
There's a new era of opportunity for NATO to expand its vision, now that improved transatlantic ties have eased concerns over the alliance's most fundamental mission, collective defense.
We consider Article 5 a sacred commitment.
This gives NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg space to launch initiatives unthinkable during the Trump administration. Among his highest ambitions, for NATO to become a leader in combating global warming, for its own sake, as militaries are having to adapt their operations and installations to rising temperatures, as well as prepare to respond to more natural disasters and crises over taxed resources.
What we have to do is partly to improve the way we just understand the link between security and climate change. We need to adapt the way we conduct our missions and operations, and then we have to reduce emissions from military operations.
Stoltenberg would like to see NATO militaries contribute more to the goal of carbon neutrality by the year 2050, but there won't be any binding commitments. Some governments are less than enthusiastic about climate action becoming a NATO issue, but Stoltenberg is undeterred.
Even if you're not very concerned about global warming, you should be concerned about the need to have modern military equipment. And I'm absolutely certain that in the future, modern military equipment will be environmentally friendly.
One immediate task will be to help countries figure out how much their defense sectors actually emit, because today few countries measure. Those that do are allowed to keep the figure secret.
When you look at the tables here, you know, it's non-reported and non-reported, etc.
European Union lawmaker Malin Bjork helped lead an effort to expose military emissions of some European countries, even though climate agreements do not require governments to account for them.
It is unacceptable that the military is exempt from reporting obligations and then also from strategies to reduce carbon emissions.
A 2019 report by Brown University identified the U.S. military as the largest single emitter of greenhouse gases on the planet. But European militaries are also responsible and must do their share, says former head of the Dutch Defense Forces Tom Middendorp. He was nicknamed the Green General several years ago when he started pressing this message.
No, I'm not a climate activist. I'm a military professional.
Now retired, Middendorp devotes much of his time to what he calls climate-proofing defense. He insists this is not optional.
Now we are finding out how it shapes our security environment, how it shapes our geopolitical environment, and how it affects our capabilities. So increasingly, we realize that we have to take this seriously and that we need to be part of that game to counter it.
And even if allies are divided, Middendorp encourages Stoltenberg to aim high and fight hard for climate action.
So, Terry, big issues being discussed there at that NATO summit, including the implications of climate change. But nuts and bolts problems still need addressing, not least Afghanistan. NATO is pulling its troops out there. The drawdown is due to be complete later this year. Is that all really settled now?
It sort of feels that way, Terry, because, of course, Afghanistan used to be so high on the agenda of every NATO meeting, and it's not going to be. At this summit, we've talked about some of the things that are of really pressing concern. China, climate change, cyber is also going to be something that is talked about, the challenges from Russia. With Afghanistan, with the drawdown decided, with NATO and U.S. forces pulling out by September at the latest, as it's now planned, it sort of feels like that big decision has been made. NATO does have a lot of questions to answer about its future relationship with Afghanistan, because it has pledged to continue supporting the Afghan armed forces. It also says that it will continue to help protect women, to keep girls in school, to help protect civil society that has been allowed to grow while the armed forces have been there, while the NATO forces have been there. And those people and those institutions are very concerned now without the protection of international forces. And NATO doesn't have the answers to these questions yet. Secretary General Stoltenberg is honest about that. They're going to have to talk about how they continue to support this country, where they devoted the last 2 decades to trying to stabilize it.
Terry, thank you so much, as always. That was DW correspondent Terry Schultz in Brussels. Now, G7 leaders wrapped up their summit over the weekend, addressing some of the world's biggest challenges, including the pandemic and climate change. But more than anything, the summit in Cornwall, England, was a chance to reassert transatlantic unity after the fractious Trump years.
COVID-19, climate change, and China. Challenges that both united and divided leaders of the world's largest economies as they closed out their 3-day summit devoted to a shared pledge to build back better. Brushing aside a squabble over Brexit in Northern Ireland, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson proclaimed it a hugely successful meeting of minds.
There has been a fantastic degree of harmony, between the leaders of our countries. And if you look at some of the things, they come together to agree, a billion more doses, a billion more vaccines. Everyone agreed to phase out the use of coal. A new Atlantic Charter, a plan to build back better for the world. I don't think that really I could have asked for a more cooperative or a more energetic spirit from our friends.
And friendships were a dominant theme, with U.S. President Joe Biden and his committed transatlanticism warmly embraced. Biden declared victory in getting support for a tougher stance on China, as well as a plan to invest perhaps trillions in developing countries to create an economic counterweight to Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, with higher standards for human rights and labor.
The G7 explicitly agreed to call out human rights abuses in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, explicitly. 2, to coordinate a common strategy to deal with China non-market policies that undermine competition. They've agreed, and that's underway now, how to do that. 3, to take serious actions against forced labor in solar, agriculture, and the garment industries, because that's where it's happening. And they've agreed we will do that.
The final communique also emphasizes the need for a thorough investigation into the origins of COVID-19, including in China. That's aimed at preventing another pandemic, while German Chancellor Angela Merkel welcomed the pledge to donate more vaccines now to end this one.
Here
we agreed this pandemic can only be defeated globally. The way out of the pandemic is vaccines. We must ensure access to vaccines for all.
But
warming ties among global leaders didn't produce much action against global warming. The G7 renewed a pledge to raise $100 billion per year to help poor countries deal with climate change. That was due to be fulfilled already last year.
Never before in the history of the G7 has there been such a big failure in contrast to what needs to be done.
More protesters await Biden and his European counterparts in Brussels as they meet Monday for a summit at NATO.
For more, we're joined now by our chief international editor, Richard Walker. Richard, host Boris Johnson put a very positive spin on that summit. Was it really as successful as he makes it out to be?
Yeah, well, Terry, it is natural for the summit host to put a positive spin on things, especially if you're Boris Johnson. Of course, that's his style. But I think much more important here than the hosts are the Americans, of course, because this was Joe Biden's debut or kind of re-entry to the world stage since becoming president earlier this year. And his team is going to be pretty happy, I think, going back home after this, or rather going on to Brussels for the NATO summit. I mean, their goal broadly has been projecting unity and projecting competence. And I think on both fronts, they're going to be fairly happy. On unity, it's true. Northern Ireland has been a bugbear between the EU and the UK, and that sort of squabble is not resolved yet. That is a bit of a fly in the ointment. But the broader picture of the West kind of rallying together and saying that we want to take on the big challenges, these kind of competence issues, like we can deal with the pandemic, we can deal with economic recovery, we can deal with climate change, for all of the criticism that there are on these individual points, still the G7 is saying we are here, we are able to do these things. And I think the Biden team will be quite happy with that.
Now, the G7 singled out China for criticism, Richard, scolding it over human rights violations and unfair trade practices. How's this going to affect relations with China?
Well, the Chinese are definitely not going to be happy with this. Their embassy in London, in fact, put out a statement before the G7 communique came out, sort of saying, you know, this is not the club that rules the world anymore. But this was really a key area where Biden sought that unity, and he seems to have got a decent amount of it. I mean, Biden is framing this era as a kind of battle of the systems between democracies and autocracies, and many Europeans are very uncomfortable about that, particularly here in Germany, where the economy is highly dependent on China. They're very concerned about getting into too confrontational a situation with China, and yet, despite that, the communique, this statement at the end of the summit, singled out China over 4 distinct areas and implicitly singled out China in many other areas too. I think, again, on this, the Biden team are going to be quite happy.
Richard, thank you so much. Our chief international editor, Richard Walker.